Thank you for watching this presentation. My name is John Cornicello, and I am here to help you along in your journey of exploring lighting control. I will be throwing a lot of information at you. You can make wonderful photos without knowing any of this, but this knowledge will help you if you have it stored in the back of your mind. You might get some inspiration from it. You might use it to troubleshoot a situation you are in. The knowledge gives you another dimension to your creativity. When you are actually making the photographs, don't think about things like Rembrandt or butterfly lighting, even though I will mention them in the presentation. Think about the mood. What energy do you get from the image, not what lights were placed where. Use this information to guide you, but go your own way. I'm not asking you to light the way I do. Light for your taste and needs. Take any lighting diagrams, whether here today or in a book, as instruction, but not as command. Forget the diagrams and make use of the theory you have learned. The theory will tell you what the light can say, but you have to determine what it does say. There is no right or wrong. Your subject and your creative ideas should inform the lighting, not the other way around. Be yourself and follow your gut on creativity. So, what are we actually photographing? Whether it be a tree, a person, a still life, whatever, we are recording light. So let's look at some basic properties of light. We'll start with the quality or character of light. I will offer my definitions of these terms in a few minutes, but now just think about hard or soft light. Next we have contrast, or how light or dark the shadows are in our photographs. How does that affect the mood of the photograph? Then we have direction. Where does the light come from? How does that affect the mood? The quantity of light is controlled by the power of the light and the distance between the light and the subject. In some lights, the power of the light is set and the light is either on or off. Other lights let you vary the power settings, giving you more control over the scene. Distance, to me, is one of the most important considerations in lighting. There's going to be a section coming up just to talk about distance. And then there's the color of light, and how do all five of these things affect the mood or feeling of the photograph? While color is very important, this presentation will concentrate on the first four. I won't go much into color here. Again, I'm asking, what are we photographing? The scene is made up of a variety of elements, starting with the diffuse value or true tone, which is the surface and texture of the main subject. That could be the bark on a tree, the clothing on the fashion shot, or the skin of your portrait subject. Then there are specular reflections, which are direct reflections of the light source. They act like little mirrors of the light source. Shadows are the underexposed darker areas. Shadows can be cast by an object, such as the nose on your portrait subject, or they can happen when a part of the subject is turned away from the light source, making it darker. The transitions are the areas between the shadow and diffuse reflection, and between the diffuse reflection and the highlights or specular reflections. There, width and gradient are how I look at the hardness or softness of the light. We cannot talk about hard and soft light without first coming to an understanding of what these terms mean. Hard and soft are subjective terms, and we all feel or expect something different when we hear these terms. Hard light is easy to define. There are dark and hard edge shadows in the scene. The light is specular. It comes from direct parallel light rays, giving us that hard, crisp look. Soft light is a bit more nebulous. It's possible that soft shouldn't be the term, as there are too many feelings associated with the word soft. Unfortunately, I don't have a new term, so instead I will define it for this presentation. A soft light comes from a large light source in close so that it provides its own fill light so that objects in the scene, such as the nose in the portrait, cast a shadow with a gradual transition between the shadow and the true tone of the face. The shadow can be dark or open, that is contrast, which is an effect from the environment. Diffuse light, where the light rays are scattered and somewhat random, gives a softer quality of light, or a softer character. Here we see hard light, a softer light with some shading and dimension, and a totally soft look. Now we're looking at the true tone or diffuse reflections of the face along with the specular reflection, the actual light source reflected, and the shadow. There are actually two types of shadows. One is the shadow cast by an object like the nose here, which is determined by the size of the light compared to the subject. The other is the shadow, such as on the cheek where the surface is turned away from the light, making that part of the subject darker. The shadow density is determined by the environment. That is light bounced back from into the shadows from the walls, ceiling, floor, added reflectors, and the like. Or by the use of black cards or negative film, we can make those darker. Back to our definitions. Contrast describes the tone of the shadows. Are they dense and dark, or are they open and airy? We can have a soft light with dark shadows or a hard light with open shadows. That brings us to the environment the photo is being made in. A small room with white walls and ceiling will fill in the shadows. An open field on a moonless night will not provide any fill light. And a brief mention of color here, as a wooden floor can warm up an image, and the green grass of the field can bounce some unexpected color into the shadows. Diffusion will have its own discussion later on. Diffusion just spreads the light to cover a wider area. It does not soften the light unless it is larger than the light origin. Grids are the opposite of diffusion. They restrict the light. They keep it from bouncing around the environment, and they cause more contrast. The light origin is the original source, or the bare light that is on our subject. The light source is the illuminated surface closest to the subject that is providing the light on the subject. This could be the front surface of a softbox or a scrim, or an overcast sky modifying the sun, or it could be a reflective surface that we would call reflector main that is bouncing light from behind the subject. In the studio, we can take a hard light as our light origin and modify it to become a larger light source. What are these modifiers? Modifiers are devices put in front of the light origin to become the light source. They change and control the beam of the light rays. Some diffuse or spread the light. Some restrict the light. There are softboxes, octaboxes, lenses, spotlights, snoots, grids, and many others. I know we're not going into color in depth here, but I should mention that different modifiers, especially from different suppliers, often have a different color effect. Here's a set of images made with the same light with a few different modifiers. You can easily see the color differences between them. We do not have to point our lights directly at our subject. Most of the time I have the light pointed a bit in front of the subject. This is called feathering the light. Instead of using the center beam, we use the spill light to control the edge of the lighting pattern. By adjusting the angle of the light, we can change the evenness of the light across our subjects. With one light and two people, I can make the person on the right brighter, both people equally bright, or the person on the left brighter. Quality, or hard and soft, is different than contrast, which some might also describe as hard or soft. This is often confusing, so let's take a closer look. Here are illustrations to show a soft gradual transition with high contrast, a hard edge transition with high contrast, a gradual transition with low contrast, and a hard transition with low contrast. You can choose what you want. There isn't any right or wrong. It's all up to the mood you want. Here I'm concentrating on the shadow cast by the nose. It's affected by both the relative size of the light and by the environment. The size of the light determines the edge quality and the density of the cast shadow. The environment adds more control over the density without changing the edge quality. If you're working in a dark environment and you want to have less contrast, use more diffuse light and head white reflectors around your subject. Grids, which are available for hard metal dish reflectors and for softboxes and the like, are a way to control the spill from your lights to gain contrast when working in a light color environment. We'll have more about grids later. Your studio environment is a big factor in controlling the contrast of the photograph. Light bounces around the room and back into the scene. I'll call this environmental fill. Look at this from the point of view of the subject. I am doing that here by photographing the reflection in the eye. Everything you see reflected in the eye is contributing in some big or small way to the look of the subject. This is lit with a diffused light bouncing all around the room and filling in the shadows to lower the contrast. You can see all of the surfaces bouncing light back in, from the light walls and the ceiling to the wood floor that is actually adding warmth too. With a more directional light, less of the room is lit up. Less of the environment is contributing to the image. And as less of the floor is illuminated, the tone of this photo is slightly cooler than the previous photo. It's easy to start being confused by what is happening as we adjust our lights. Some of what happens seems counter to what we would expect. Bringing a light in closer doesn't make the light harsher, just the opposite. It does make the light brighter, but we can control that with our exposure. Here the two softboxes are the same physical size, but when in closer to the subject the box becomes relatively larger, or we sometimes say it is larger as seen by the subject. At the bottom we have a speed light. As you can see, it is small when it's close and when it's far away. Let's go to the videotape.
Let's look at what happens when we put diffusion over the light. Here our lovely model, who graciously maintains the same pose and expression for us, is lit by a 7-inch metal dish reflector placed about 30 inches away. Pay attention to the nose shadow. Notice how dark it is and how quickly it transitions from dark to light. Definitely a hard light. When I add a sheet of diffusion material over the light, you will see that little, if anything, changes on the face of the subject. The shadow is still dark and still has a hard edge. What you cannot see is that the light got dimmer, so I had to raise the power of the light to maintain the same exposure. So some might mistakenly say that the light is less intense and thereby softer. But there is no visual change to the shadow edge. It is not any softer in terms of quality. But when I add a white reflector on the opposite side from the light, we see a big difference. I have now modified the environment. I'm giving the light something to bounce off and fill in the shadows, making it lighter in tone. But look at the edge transition. It is still the same hard edge shadow. Is this soft light?
Again, we have to ask, what do we mean by soft light?
Now I am changing from the small dish reflector to a 24 by 36 inch softbox at the same 30-inch distance from the face. Notice that the shadow edge has become much less defined as light strikes the face from more angles and directions, creating its own fill light to soften the transition. When I place the white foam core reflector now, the shadow is almost completely gone with its wide transition and lower density. Here we have a soft light. Now you might point out that the softbox does have a diffuser, and most actually have two. So is the diffusion that is softening? No. The internal diffuser is there to spread the light evenly to fill the outer panel, which then becomes your large light source. It is the size of this panel that determines the shadow edge. The diffusion mirror material provides an even coverage across the face of the softbox, but it is the fact that the light is now much larger in size that softens the shadow edge.
The bottom light here shows what the double diffusion does in the softbox. It takes the light origin and spreads it out so it fills the entire front panel of the softbox. Reiterating softness versus contrast. Grasp the difference between the size of the light and its effect mostly on cast shadows versus the environment and its effect on all shadows. We already talked about feathering to make the light more even across the scene, but does it also make the light softer? Feathering actually makes the light source look smaller as seen by the subject, and a smaller light at the same distance is a harder light. I've read magazine articles and heard photographers claim that a faraway light is the softest light. The only thing I can come up with to explain this is that they are thinking about intensity, like the breeze from a fan. A light farther away is less intense. Is that softer than the same light up close? But that is not softer in quality, just intensity, and we can control that by adjusting the exposure by changing the power of our lights. Here's an example from a magazine article. What were they thinking? Next is light coverage. Most softboxes put out a light beam around 90 degrees wide. It doesn't matter what size they are. At normal working distances, they cover the same area of the scene. These three photos were made with three different softboxes. Upper left is a small 16 by 20, upper right is a 24 by 36, and the bottom is a 36 by 48 inch softbox. Notice that the light covers the same area of the subject and background in each. The differences are in the shadow size and densities. Now we come to light patterns, and there must be some rule that all lighting presentations talk about light patterns, so here they are. Look at them, understand them, remember them, then forget about them. It is more important to feel how the direction of the light affects the mood. Your client isn't going to ask for a Rembrandt or a loop light. I will use those common terms for consistency, though. Split light comes from the side. As such, it emphasizes texture and creates a certain mood. Rembrandt light also comes from the side, but not as far back and up higher as if from a skylight in the studio. Look for the telltale triangle highlight under one eye with the nose shadow touching the corner of the mouth. Think 45-degree angles. Actually, forget that. Just think more about the mood you want to create than a specific named light pattern. Loop light comes from around front a little bit more and a little bit lower, so the nose shadow does not meet the lip. This is probably the most used pattern for general portraits and headshots, But again, think of the mood and emotion you want in your photos. Front light comes from the front straight onto the face, but remember these patterns are all between the face and the light, not the camera. If the subject turned to the right, the light has to move to the right. Where other light directions emphasize the form of the subject, the three-dimensionality, front light flattens out the form and relies on contrast within the subject to describe the subject. Watch for the shadow under the nose and how close it comes to the lip. Shadows move in the opposite direction than the light moves, so if you want to move the shadow up closer to the nose or get more light in the eyes, you have to move the light down. Here are examples of the basic light patterns with harder and softer light. While I don't consider these to be light patterns, they are related. Short light illuminates the side of the face away from the camera. Broad light illuminates the side of the face towards the camera. Photographers tend to prefer short light, but when I've visited paintings in portrait galleries around the world, I see that painters tend to like broad light. Here are examples of short and broad lighting and the lighting diagrams for them. For short light, have your subject keep their nose pointed between the camera and the main light. For broad light, have your subject point their nose towards the opposite side of the camera, away from the main light. As I said, I found very few short-lit painted portraits in museums. And then there's butterfly light. Why? It relates to the shape of the shadow under the nose looking like a butterfly. And no, I don't always see it either. And then we have a silhouette. A silhouette is lit from behind the subject to reveal only the shape of the subject. More things to keep in mind. Light from the side rakes over the surface of the subject, showing all the nooks and crannies. It brings out a lot of form. Front light fills in everything and acts like an additional layer of makeup to smooth out the texture. Light from behind emphasizes the shape of the subject. Distance also plays a part in creating your mood. I'll come back to this topic, one of my favorite concepts to think and talk about. As you move a light closer or farther from your subject, the intensity of the light on the subject changes. Some people describe this as fall off. The light doesn't really fall off, it just spreads out with fewer rays of photons hitting the subject as the light is moved back. The other rays simply bypass the subject and continue as the light fans out. The inverse square law is a law that says I have to talk about inverse square. Light falls off in intensity to the square of the distance or some geeky thing like that. It's like lighting patterns. Twice the distance provides 1/4 or 2 stops less light on the subject in theory. The law refers to a point source of light, which we don't normally encounter. A visual might help explain it. Another illustration to help understand what is happening. Moving the light back makes the stamp wider and with fewer photons affecting the subject. But most of what you need to know about the inverse square can be simplified down to this. The closer your light is to your subject, the darker the background will be. The farther the light is from the subject, the wider and deeper the light will penetrate the scene and make it brighter overall. Inverse square applies to the sun, but the scale is so great that its effect is negligible on Earth. The sun is so far away that the light rays that hit the Earth are virtually parallel and remain the same intensity over great distances. The light on your subject is the same intensity as the light on the background. It doesn't matter if the background is 5 feet, 50 feet, or 500 feet away. The same intensity of light hits Mount Everest as it hits Death Valley. In daylight, clouds, especially on an overcast day, become nature's softbox. Remember back to the slide on light origin and light source. The sun is the origin, the cloud cover is the source. An overcast sky provides light from many different angles and directions, making for a very large soft light source. In the studio, we don't have clouds, so we use light modifiers to change the characteristics of our lights. Think of things like metal dish reflectors, softboxes, umbrellas, spotlights, and on and on. Most are either rectangular or roundish in shape. How round depends on the construction of the modifier. There are 8-sided umbrellas and there are 24-sided deep parabolic softboxes. The light stamp from round lights is a bit more even all around the subject than from rectangular lights, but that isn't usually very noticeable. Strip softboxes that are long and narrow show the biggest difference in coverage. They provide soft light in the long direction and harder light in the wide direction. In vertical position, the shadow edges at the top and bottom of the subject will be softer than for those from side to side. Here we see 2 photos made with a 1x4 strip box at the same distance. The first one has the light vertical and the other one has it horizontal. Notice the difference in shadows from the two orientations. Here the light is 4 feet from the subject, and the subject is about a foot from the background. And here are the same with the soft grid on the 1x4 strip box. And here are all four together. And now I brought the light in closer, cutting the distance in half to 2 feet. In portraits, the most obvious indication of what light was used is in the catchlight in the eyes. You can get into many a philosophical discussion about what shape the catchlight should be, round or rectangular, but that is up to you and your vision. Some photographers prefer round light sources, claiming that the round catchlight is more natural because the eyeball is round and the sun is round. Other photographers, such as myself, like rectangular catchlights. This is because we rarely see the catchlight from the sun because the subject would be squinting. Instead, we see catchlights from windows, doors, skylights, lampshades, and big open skies. Most of these present themselves as rectangular light sources. Here we can see the catchlights from a 2x3 softbox, a 22-inch beauty dish, and a 48-inch umbrella. My preference is for rectangular lights that look like a window or doorway. I also put some strips of black tape on the surface of the softbox to simulate window panes. If you do product photography, you might want to stick with rectangular lights and avoid umbrellas. If you are photographing shiny objects like a wine bottle or chrome appliances, the shape becomes much more important. Rectangular light sources tend to look much better in shiny reflections. Most softboxes have a fixed light position at the back of the box. Everything is enclosed, so light won't leak and bounce around the studio. Umbrellas let you ride the light up and down the shaft to mount it closer or farther from this umbrella. This gives you a bit of ability to focus the light. Deep parabolic softboxes take this to an extreme. But many so-called parabolic umbrellas are not quite parabolic in shape. Here you see the shape of the parabolic umbrella on the left with a true parabola on the right. The closer to a parabola, the more control you will have when positioning the lamp that is pointing back into the modifier. By moving the lighting closer to the modifier, focusing it, the more parallel the light rays come out. You have a large spotlight. When you move it out and defocus the light, you get a more diffuse light that some claim is magical in its appearance. Then there's umbrellas. For a while it seemed like umbrellas were forgotten or scorned, but lately I see a lot of umbrella use and a number of new umbrella designs. They can be really quite versatile and inexpensive, but just be careful when you use them outdoors. They are efficient sails and the slightest breeze will take them away. Good thing they're inexpensive. Umbrellas come in different shapes and different fabrics and depths. Silver umbrellas are more directional and hence more contrasty. Deep umbrellas are more directional and contrasty too. White surface umbrellas are more neutral and more diffuse with a wider, less directional output that lets the light bounce around the environment for potentially less contrast. Of course, if there's nothing for the light to bounce off of, the contrast will not be lessened. Translucent umbrellas, sometimes called see-through umbrellas, can be brought in closer to the subject and provide a little more saturation. They can also have a wider output for more environmental fill and less contrast. Having modifiers of different sizes allows us to change the quality of light by changing the size of the light relative to the subject without having to move the light. Moving the light changes more than its relative size. It changes the depth and spread of the light and the intensity of the light. I find the effects of distance to be some of the most interesting things to observe. If we have determined the light to subject distance to get the depth and spread we want, we don't want to change the distance to change the quality, so we need to change the size of the light. The change in intensity is not as important, as we can change the power of the light to compensate. Distance determines how deep the light will penetrate into the scene. Think back to the inverse square. A light in close makes the background go darker. The light falls off quickly with a nice gradual shadow edge transition. It also allows us to light the background separately from the subject. As you move the light farther away from the subject, the light penetrates deeper into the scene, making the background brighter with the light covering a wider area of the scene. And here's where it really gets to be fun. So much control. Let it all become part of your subconscious knowledge. In close, there is great contrast between the subject and the background, but a smooth shadow edge transition. As you move the light back, it becomes smaller with the harder cast shadows, but more of the environment is lit, and the scene is flatter with less subject to background contrast. And all of those surfaces act to fill in the depth of the cast shadows too. You can see the same thing with window light. With the subject close to the window, the light falls off quickly. but as you move back further into the room, the light penetrates deeper and wider with less fall-off. In addition to the effect on subject versus background, the distance affects hotspots on the subject. In portraits, this can help control a bright forehead or hotspots on the bridge of the nose or the chin. This is another area that might seem counterintuitive. Bringing the light in closer will lessen the appearance of the hotspots on the subject. Remember that we are dealing with two types of reflections, the diffuse true value reflection and the specular mirror-like reflection. So what happens when we change the light to subject distance? When moving the light in closer or farther back from the subject, the specular reflections remain the same brightness. This might at first seem to contradict the inverse square law, but instead the size of the light changes depending on the distance. As you move a light in closer to your subject, the hotspot gets larger without getting brighter. At the same time, the subject itself does get brighter, and there is less brightness difference between the subject and the highlights. Of course, now everything is overexposed, so you lower the power of the lights and maintain the new brightness range between the subject and the highlights. How much less noticeable? A lot. The light moved in from 3 meters to 1 meter will lower the brightness of the hotspot 9 times while maintaining the same true tone exposure on the subject. Here the light was set at 36 inches, 18 inches, and 12 inches. Notice the change in size of the hotspots and how they get larger and appear dimmer as the light is brought in closer. In reality, the hotspots remain the same brightness while the subject got brighter. Again, lighting knowledge can also be used in product photography. With the light farther away, the highlight on the can is narrow and intense. It's very difficult to read the text behind the highlight. When the light is moved in closer, the highlight is wider and the text is much easier to read. Grids. Getting back to grids. They're used in very close to the subject. They provide more contrast and saturation. Here's a look at the difference when the light is close with and without a grid. When using a grid, don't put a diffusion over the grid. You might be tempted at some point to try it. Don't. Here's a visual of what happens with grids and diffusion. The top photo is made with a 7-inch dish reflector. The second photo I added a grid. For the third photo I put a sheet of diffusion in front of the grid, and you can see that the light is back to where I started, but about 3 stops less powerful. One more diagram to drive this home. As with everything in photography, there are trade-offs. The cells of the grid show up as distractions in the catchlight in the eyes, but these can be retouched out in post-processing if too distracting. As I said, distance is one of my favorite topics to explore, whether it is in light or as in camera-to-subject distance. And after that comes diffusion. I see so much misinformation about diffusion. So many people suffer from what I call diffusion confusion. Let's state 2 things. Diffusion on its own does not soften the light, and diffusion doesn't help reduce specular hotspots. We have already looked a bit at hotspots being controlled by distance. How about diffusion over a light? The diffusion spreads the light over a wider area. That in turn reduces the intensity on the subject, but it does an overall reduction. It doesn't target the highlights. So the range between the diffuse reflection and the highlight remains the same. Doubling or tripling diffusion doesn't change that. Where extra diffusion does come into play is it cuts down on the hotspot across the surface of the modifiers. The diffusion homogenizes the light across the light source, and you would notice this in reflective surfaces in your photos. This will also help get rid of a double-edged shadow that you might get from a small and diffuse metal dish reflector, like the 7-inch, that is due to the difference in efficiency of the light bulb versus the reflector around the bulb. Remember, soft light comes from a bigger light source. Diffusion directly on a light source that is the same size as the light is not softer. Diffusion placed on a light will spread the beam of light into a wider pattern, but this doesn't soften the light because the size of the light isn't changed. It might open up the shadows from environmental bounce, but less contrast is not the same as soft light. A diffuser can soften the light if the diffuser is larger than and separated from the light origin. Notice that the shadow edge didn't change when diffusion was added, but when I made the light larger by using a scrim a bit in front of the light, it did soften the edge. So what about that shadow side of the subject? How do we open that up a bit? My preference is not to use a second light, but to instead bounce in some light, usually from a white board, but sometimes a gray board. The trick is in where you place the board. My preference is to fill from the front, on axis with the lens coverage. If the fill is too far to the side and back, it can leave a shadow in the middle of the face and end up lighting the ear. But what a difference our friend Phil does make. I go for studio flash over constant lights. They have more power, more control, more modifiers. I know they might seem intimidating at first, but you can get used to flash quickly and have less to worry about, including shutter speed, to some degree that is. You do need to know the sync speed of your camera. And when you do, you need to test it with your off-camera flash units. You might need to go to a slower speed than the official sync speed. Longer shutter speeds can let in ambient light to affect the scene as fill light. You can check for this by taking a photo without the flash using the same settings as if the flash were to fire and see if anything gets recorded. In most situations with flash, your ISO will be low enough and your aperture high enough that the ambient light will not be an issue. Just be careful for subject movement and color casts, but those might be the reason you want to slow down the shutter. My typical studio settings are ISO 100, 125th of a second, and at the aperture that I want for depth of field. Here's what happens between your camera's shutter when the flash is in sync and when it's not. So the shutter opens. When it's open full, the flash fires, then the shutter closes. And here's what happens when the shutter speed is set higher than the flash sync speed. The shutter is opened, it starts to close, then the flash fires, and then the shutter closes completely. And you get a band across your photo. The listed sync speed for the camera used here was 1/200, but notice at the 1/200 slide, there's some darkening along the bottom edge of the frame where the second curtain started to encroach before the flash fired. That is why I tend to go with 1/125 with studio strobes and remote triggering. I've used some remote flash triggers that introduce a delay and only work at 1/100 or slower. Before you ask, let's talk about eyeglasses. Sometimes we luck out and our subject has glasses with some miracle anti-reflection coating, but often they don't, so we turn to the billiards players for help. The angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection. Here we see the glare in the first photo. For the second photo, I simply raised the light higher to change those angles, and for the third photo, I turned the subject away from the light to a broad light setup. It's all about the angles. If the light is higher, the reflection goes lower. And then there are light meters, the $64,000 question. Should you use a light meter? It won't hurt, except maybe for the initial cost, and it can help. It can at least speed up the process of dialing in the exposure. When using a light meter to make a reading, point the dome of the meter at the light source to get the exposure for the true value. If you point it at the camera, it averages out the entire scene contrast. You don't need to stay with what the meter says. That gives you just a starting point. From there, you can change the power output of the lights to suit your mood and vision. You have to decide on the mood and how your exposure contributes to it. If you do decide to make a change the power of the light up or down. Don't change the aperture. You already selected the f-stop for the depth of field you need. Don't change the light distance. You already selected that for the depth of light you wanted. So, what are the takeaways? What do we need to learn, know, and forget? The closer your light is to your subject, the darker the background will be and the less intense the hotspots will be. Decide on your light to subject distance and the f-stop for depth of light and depth of field. Then select the modifier size for character. Then select the power of the light for the appropriate exposure. I want to thank you for watching. You can find more on my YouTube and in my book, Anatomy of a Studio Portrait, or in my Facebook group.